I'm Major Victoria Hudson, 33, United States Air Force. I worked my way up from cadet to field grade officer, one deployment, one decision, one sleepless night at a time. For years, I showed up for my family the same way I showed up for my unit, steady, dependable, the one who fixed what other people broke. But when my cousin mocked my drinking problem in front of everyone at a family barbecue, the silence I'd kept out of loyalty finally met its breaking point. Have you ever been humiliated by someone who owed you respect? Someone who turned your pain into their punchline? If you have, tell me your story in the comments. You're not the only one. Before I explain what really happened that night, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground and reclaim your worth after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about strength, boundaries, and the quiet kind of revenge called dignity. What happened next might surprise you. I stood at the edge of my uncle's backyard, watching smoke curl up from the grill and listening to the familiar soundtrack of a family gathering, laughter too loud, beer cans cracking open, someone's kid shrieking in the pool. I'd been home for exactly 4 hours after 3 months deployed, and already I could feel the familiar distance settling in. Not the kind that comes from being overseas. The kind that comes from being the only one at the table who knows what 0400 hours looks like from the wrong side of a bunker wall. I'm Major Victoria Hudson, Air Force, 04, 33 years old, and I've learned that the hardest part of coming home isn't the jet lag or the adjustment to quiet nights. It's the moment when someone who's never left their hometown decides they understand your life better than you do. That moment arrived around 1800 hours, right as I was pouring myself a glass of club soda. You still drinking, Vic? My cousin Evan's voice carried across the patio, loud enough to turn heads. Or is that too dangerous now? The table erupted. Uncle Jim slapped his knee. Aunt Caroline covered her mouth, trying not to laugh. Even my own mother smiled into her wine glass. I set the bottle down carefully, watching condensation bead on the glass. I didn't answer. Years of command have taught me that silence, deployed at the right moment, carries more weight than any defense. Evan Hudson was 28, permanently between jobs, and had perfected the art of being charming enough that people forgave him for contributing nothing. He had my father's easy smile and none of his discipline. Growing up, we'd been close, before I left for the academy, and he stayed behind to master the craft of disappointed potential. What? He continued, grinning at his audience. I'm just asking. Didn't you have that whole thing a few years back? That whole thing. He made it sound like I'd had a bad breakup or bought a timeshare I regretted. I took a sip of my club soda and watched him over the rim. Across the table, Colonel Charles Hudson, retired Army 06, mid-40s, Evan's father and my uncle, set his beer down with a deliberate precision that made no sound but commanded attention anyway. His expression hadn't changed, but something in his posture had shifted. I'd seen that look before, in joint briefings when someone said something profoundly stupid and a senior officer was deciding whether to correct them publicly or let them drown quietly. It's fine, I said, keeping my voice level. I'm good. She's good, Evan repeated, mimicking my tone. More laughter. That's what they all say, right? The air temperature hadn't changed, but something had cooled. I felt it in the way my mother suddenly became very interested in the potato salad, in how Uncle Jim shifted his weight and looked away. That invisible line that exists in every military family, between pride and resentment, between we support you and you think you're better than us, had just been stepped over. I'd spent the last 90 days managing logistics for a forward operating base, coordinating supply chains and personnel rotations while insurgents tested our perimeter every third night. I'd made decisions that kept people alive and filed reports on the ones who didn't make it home. But here, in this backyard in suburban Virginia, I was just Vic who couldn't handle her liquor and had to get help. Colonel Charles picked up his glass again, but he didn't drink. He was watching his son with an expression I couldn't quite read. Disappointment, maybe. Or calculation. Evan, Aunt Caroline said quietly, maybe leave it alone. What? I'm not trying to be mean. I'm just saying, it's good she got help, right? That's what you're supposed to say. It's very brave. He said brave the way you'd say participation trophy. I could have corrected him. Could have explained that the drinking problem had been a convenient cover story for something else entirely, something that remained classified and would stay that way. Could have told him about Operation Halcyon, about the 72 hours when everything went wrong and the only thing standing between 12 lives and a catastrophic loss was my voice on the radio and my ability to make calls that no captain should have to make. But I didn't. Because people who haven't earned the right to know your worst days don't get to hear about them over barbecue and beer. I appreciate your concern, I said instead, and watched him preen at what he thought was my gratitude. The conversation moved on. Someone started talking about football. Uncle Jim put more burgers on the grill. The sun dropped lower, painting everything gold and forgiving, and I stood there with my club soda thinking about the distance between what people see and what actually is. Evan launched into a story about his latest business idea, something involving cryptocurrency and energy drinks, and I half listened while calculating how soon I could leave without it becoming a thing. My mother would be disappointed. She always wanted these gatherings to mean something, wanted the family to stay close despite the miles and years and choices that kept pulling us in different directions. But closeness requires honesty, and honesty requires trust, and trust is earned through something more than shared DNA and childhood summers. Colonel Charles stood up, excusing himself to grab something from inside. As he passed behind my chair, his hand touched my shoulder briefly, so quick anyone watching would have missed it. A gesture of solidarity, of recognition. It occurred to me that he might be the only person at this table who actually understood why I'd stopped drinking, and why that reason had nothing to do with weakness. He'd served 30 years in the Army, most of it in intelligence and special operations. He knew what classified meant. He knew what happened to people who carried weight they couldn't talk about. And unlike his son, he knew the difference between suffering and failure. The light faded further. Someone turned on the patio lights, and in that sudden brightness, everyone looked softer, younger, almost innocent. These were good people, mostly. They loved me in the abstract way that family loves, proud of my uniform, uncomfortable with what it represented, grateful they didn't have to think too hard about where I'd been or what I'd done. Evan was still talking, gesturing with his beer, and I found myself wondering what it would take for him to understand. Not the classified parts, those would stay buried, but the basic arithmetic of sacrifice. The simple fact that some people spend their lives in service to something larger, and that service costs more than a Sunday afternoon could ever account for. I finished my club soda and set the glass down. The condensation had left a ring on the table, a temporary mark that would disappear as soon as someone wiped it away. Ephemeral evidence. There and then gone, like so many other things. Colonel Charles returned, carrying a fresh beer he didn't open. He sat down and the conversation continued to flow around us, easy and meaningless and comfortable. But something had shifted. I felt it in the way he positioned himself, the way his attention had sharpened. A decision had been made, though I didn't yet know what it was. I just knew that the evening wasn't over, and that Evan's easy laughter was about to cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. The sun had fully set by the time Evan found his second wind. That's the thing about people who've never faced real consequences, they don't know when to stop talking. Remember that time Vic said she'd be home for Christmas and then just wasn't? He was addressing the table now, playing to his audience. We had the whole thing planned, and she just bailed. Said it was work stuff. It was work stuff, I said quietly. My mother shot me a look that said let it go, but I'd already let plenty go. Sure, work stuff. Look, I support the troops as much as anyone, but come on. You can't tell me there's not some flexibility in that system. He gestured vaguely, as if the entire Department of Defense was a suggestion more than a structure. My dad was military for 30 years, and he still made it home for holidays. Colonel Charles went very still. Different circumstances, I said. Different conflicts, different requirements. Different priorities, maybe. Evan grinned like he'd scored a point. I'm just saying, some people manage to balance it. Have a life and a career. Not everyone has to be so hardcore about everything. The word hardcore came out twisted, like an accusation. Like dedication was a personality flaw rather than a requirement. Uncle Jim cleared his throat. Evan, maybe we should know, it's cool. Vic knows I'm just giving her a hard time. We're family, right? We can be honest. He turned to me directly. I mean, the drinking thing, that's part of it too. All that stress, because you can't learn to chill out. That's what Dad always said, you gotta know when to ease up or you'll break. I never said that. Colonel Charles's voice cut through the conversation like a blade. Not once. Evan blinked. Yeah, you did. You said she pushed too hard, I said she carried a burden that would break most people. That's not the same thing. The patio went quiet. Even the kids in the pool seemed to sense something and lowered their voices. Okay, well. Evan laughed, but it sounded forced now. Point is, everyone needs to relax sometimes. That's healthy. That's normal. Not everyone can be perfect. Perfect, I repeated. The word tasted bitter. Is that what you think this is about? Isn't it? You join the Air Force, you get promoted, you're this big deal officer, and meanwhile some of us are just trying to figure life out without a manual and a rank structure telling us what to do every second. There it was. The real complaint. Not concern, not affection. Resentment dressed up as humor, bitterness wrapped in brotherly teasing. You're right, I said. You don't have a manual. But you do have opportunities one helped create, whether you remember it or not. What's that supposed to mean? It means that when you crashed my car at 17, I took the blame because I knew my record could handle it and yours couldn't. It means that when you needed a reference for that job 3 years ago, I wrote it, even though you'd spent the previous family dinner making jokes about my deployment. It means I've been covering for you since we were kids, Evan, because that's what family does. But family goes both ways. His face flushed. I never asked you to do any of that. No, you didn't have to ask. That's what service looks like. Aunt Caroline put her hand on Evan's arm, but he shook it off. Service. Right. Everything's about service with you people. Like the rest of us are just freeloading because we didn't join the military. That's not what she's saying, my mother tried, but Evan was on a roll now. No, I get it. I'm the failure and she's the hero. She does secret important things that nobody's allowed to talk about, and I'm just the guy who can't hold down a job. Is that it? Is that the story? The story, I said carefully, is that I've never called you a failure. You're doing that yourself. Because everyone's thinking it. You show up in your uniform looking all disciplined and accomplished, and what am I supposed to say? Yeah, I'm working on my 3rd failed startup and living in my parents' basement. You make everyone else look bad just by existing. The silence that followed was profound. I could hear the pool filter humming, the distant sound of traffic on the main road, someone's wind chimes 3 houses down. Colonel Charles set his beer down with that same deliberate precision. The sound was quiet, but in that moment it rang like a gavel. Son, he said, and his voice carried the weight of 30 years of command. Do you even know what she did for our country? Evan went pale. What? Do you know what your cousin did? What she sacrificed? What she carries? I know she had a drinking problem and got help for it. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows the story she let them believe. Colonel Charles stood up slowly. Because the truth was classified and the truth was harder and the truth made her a target for every idiot with an opinion about how female officers handle stress. Dad, what are you want to talk about not making it home for Christmas? She didn't make it because she was coordinating a rescue operation that saved 12 lives. You want to talk about drinking? She stopped drinking because she was dealing with the aftermath of watching good people die while she made the calls that kept bad situations from becoming catastrophic ones. And you want to talk about stress and breaking? She carried operational responsibility that would have crushed you in under an hour. The entire patio had frozen. My mother's hand was over her mouth. Aunt Caroline was staring at her husband like she'd never seen him before. Uncle Jim had gone white. I reviewed her after-action report, Colonel Charles continued, his eyes locked on his son. I sat on the board that evaluated Operation Halcyon. I read the commendations that never reached her file because they're buried under security classifications. I know exactly what Major Victoria Hudson did, and I know exactly what it cost her. Evan's mouth opened, but nothing came out. You laugh because you've never had to carry anything heavier than your own disappointment, Colonel Charles said quietly. She stayed silent because she knows that some stories aren't for entertainment. They're for survival. The fire in the grill popped, sending up a shower of sparks that died in the darkness. No one moved. I didn't know, Evan finally whispered. You didn't ask, I said simply. You just assumed. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something crack in his expression. Shame, maybe? Or the beginning of understanding. I'm sorry, he said. I nodded once. I know. But we both knew it wasn't enough. Words never are, not for this kind of damage. Apologies are easy. Respect has to be rebuilt from the ground up, piece by piece, choice by choice. Colonel Charles sat back down, and slowly, awkwardly, conversation limped forward. But it was different now. Everyone knew something had shifted, that a truth had been told that couldn't be untold. I stayed another hour, more for my mother than for myself. When I finally left, Evan was sitting alone by the pool, his beer untouched beside him, staring at nothing. Growing up, Evan and I were inseparable in the way that cousins sometimes are, close enough to feel like siblings, distant enough to avoid the worst of sibling rivalry. Our mothers were sisters who'd married into different worlds. Mine chose my father, a career Air Force officer who believed in structure and service. His chose Uncle Charles, Army through and through, a man who deployed so often that Evan grew up calling absence normal. When we were kids, that absence shaped us differently. I responded to my father's deployments by trying to be perfect, as if good grades and clean rooms could protect him somehow. Evan responded to his father's absences by testing every boundary, as if proving that rules were meaningless when the person enforcing them kept disappearing. The summer I turned 14, Evan's family moved in with us, while Colonel Charles was in Afghanistan. My father was stateside that year, running training operations out of Langley, and my mother offered to help Aunt Caroline manage. 6 months, they said. Just until the deployment ended. 6 months turned into 8 when the deployment was extended. 8 months of Evan and me sharing the same hallway, the same dinner table, the same strange hybrid family unit that formed out of necessity and military timing. I helped him with homework he didn't want to do. He taught me how to talk to boys I was too nervous to approach. When he stayed out past curfew, I covered for him. When I cried about my father's upcoming deployment, he sat with me and didn't make it weird. We had an understanding, the way kids do when they're navigating the same strange territory. That understanding lasted until the car incident. I was 17, newly licensed, and cautious. My father had bought me a used Toyota with the understanding that it was mine as long as I maintained it and drove responsibly. I treated that car like it was made of glass and good intentions. Evan was 16, unlicensed, and cocky. He asked to borrow it one Saturday afternoon. Said he just needed to run to a friend's house, pick something up, be back in an hour. I hesitated, but he gave me that smile, the one that had been getting him out of trouble since he could walk, and I handed over the keys. He came back 3 hours later with a crumpled front bumper and a story about a deer that didn't quite add up. My father took one look at the damage and knew exactly what had happened. Knew Evan had been driving, knew I'd been stupid enough to lend him the car, knew that the consequences for an unlicensed driver would be severe. Who was driving, he asked, his voice carrying that particular tone that meant he already knew but wanted to see who would tell the truth. Evan looked at me. His eyes were wide, terrified, pleading. I opened my mouth and said I was. My father didn't believe me. I could see it in his face, in the way his jaw tightened and his eyes went cold. But I stuck to the story. Took the insurance hit, paid the deductible out of money I'd saved from summer jobs, accepted the grounding that lasted through spring. Evan never thanked me. Not directly. But he stopped testing boundaries so hard after that, at least around me. Like he understood that I'd spent something valuable on his behalf, and that debt mattered. We graduated high school the same year, me with honors and an academy appointment, him with barely passing grades and a vague plan to maybe try community college. Our paths split cleanly. I went to Colorado Springs. He stayed home. The Air Force Academy broke me down and rebuilt me into something stronger, sharper, more resilient. For years of military training, academic rigor, and leadership development. For years of learning that discipline wasn't punishment, it was freedom. Structure wasn't limitation, it was possibility. I graduated as a second lieutenant, 22 years old, and received orders to Ramstein Air Base in Germany. Logistics and personnel management. Not glamorous, but essential. The military runs on supply chains and coordination. Someone has to make sure the right equipment reaches the right people at the right time. Evan drifted. Last I heard, he dropped out of community college after one semester. Worked retail for a while, tried his hand at being a personal trainer, quit when it got hard. His mother made excuses. His father grew quieter with each disappointment. By the time I made captain at 26, Evan had moved back into his parents' basement and started calling himself an entrepreneur. By the time I deployed to Kuwait at 28, he was on his fourth business opportunity and his second breakup with the same girlfriend. The family gatherings grew awkward. Not hostile, just different. I'd show up in uniform, tired from operations, carrying stories I couldn't tell. He'd show up with his latest plan and his practice charm, carrying resentment he didn't name. How's work? Someone would ask me. Busy. Good. Making a difference. What else could I say? How's work? Someone would ask him. Working on something big. Can't talk about it yet. But it's going to be huge. Always some variation of that. The parallel wasn't lost on me. We were both keeping secrets. Mine were classified. His were imaginary. Then came Operation Halcyon. I was 31, a captain running logistics for a forward operating base in a region I still can't name. The operation was supposed to be straightforward, resupply convoy, standard route, minimal risk. 3 C-130s carrying equipment and personnel to an embedded unit working with local forces. The intelligence was wrong. The route had been compromised. Insurgents were waiting. The first aircraft took fire on approach. The pilot executed an emergency landing hard, but controlled. The second aircraft diverted. The third tried to provide cover and took an RPG to the tail section. Communications went dark. The embedded unit was cut off. The downed aircraft crews were exposed and outnumbered. And I was the ranking officer on comms with the authority to coordinate a response. 72 hours. That's how long it took to extract everyone. 72 hours of coordinating air support, ground units, medical evacuation. 72 hours of making decisions with incomplete information and catastrophic consequences. 72 hours of listening to voices on the radio, scared, professional, dying, and trying to be the calm in their chaos. We got 12 people out alive. We lost 4. The after-action report was buried under classification protocols. The commendations were filed in places that don't show up on public records. Officially, the operation was a complex logistics challenge successfully managed under adverse conditions. Unofficially, I spent 3 months after returning stateside trying to sleep without hearing those voices, trying to eat without tasting ash, trying to function like a normal human being instead of someone who'd learned exactly how much a single wrong call could cost. The drinking started as a way to quiet my mind. A glass of wine with dinner. Then 2. Then whiskey before bed. Then whiskey instead of bed. It took 6 months before someone noticed. My commander, a lieutenant colonel named Sarah Chin who'd been through her own version of halcyon years before, pulled me aside after a briefing where I'd shown up functional but fragile. Talk to someone, she said quietly. Or I'll make it an order. I talked. Got help. Stopped drinking. Did the program correctly, thoroughly, completely. Treated recovery with the same discipline I brought to everything else. The official story was stress management and voluntary rehabilitation. The unofficial truth was that I'd carried operational weight that no captain should have to carry, and I'd cracked under it in a way that looked like weakness, but was actually just human. Colonel Charles knew. He'd sat on the review board that evaluated the operation. He'd read the reports, seen the commendations, understood the cost. But he'd kept it to himself, respecting the classification and respecting my privacy. Until the night his son decided my pain was entertainment. Until the night he decided that silence was cowardice instead of kindness. Until the night he stood up and told the truth, not because I needed defending, but because Evan needed educating. The weeks following that barbecue passed in strange silence. No apologetic phone calls, no awkward text messages, no family members trying to smooth things over. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when everyone's processing something too big to name. I went back to work. Days blended into routine, briefings at 0700, operational reviews at 1000, paperwork and planning sessions filling the hours between. The rhythm of military life has always been grounding for me. Clear expectations, measurable outcomes, defined chains of command. At home, alone in my apartment off base, the silence was different. Heavier. I'd catch myself staring at my phone, wondering if Evan would reach out. Wondering if I wanted him to. The truth Colonel Charles had revealed wasn't mine alone. It belonged to everyone who'd been on those aircraft, everyone who'd made it home, and everyone who hadn't. Sharing it at a family barbecue felt both necessary and wrong, like performing surgery in public. The patient survived, but everyone watching was traumatized. My mother called once, her voice careful. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. Charles told me more after you left." Not everything, but enough. I had no idea it was that serious. It was classified, Mom. It still is. I know. I wish you'd told me you were struggling. I wasn't struggling. I was recovering. There's a difference. She was quiet for a moment. Evan feels terrible. He should. Victoria. Mom, I love you. But I'm not interested in making him feel better about feeling bad. He earned his shame, honestly. Another pause. You sound like your father. I'll take that as a compliment. After we hung up, I sat on my couch and thought about my father. He'd retired at 55, a colonel with 3 decades of service and more medals than stories he was allowed to tell. He understood the weight of classified operations, the isolation of carrying knowledge you couldn't share. The hardest part, he told me once, isn't the danger or the decisions. It's coming home and realizing that the people who love you can't understand what you've been through. Not because they don't care, but because the gap between their experience and yours is unbridgeable. I'd been a second lieutenant then, fresh from the academy and full of certainty that I could handle anything. "So, what do you do?" I'd asked. "You find people who've been where you've been. You build a different kind of family, one that understands the cost without needing the details." I'd found that family in the Air Force. Captain Rene Alvarez, who'd been my squadron mate during Operation Halcyon and who still called every few months just to check in. Major Eric Dunn, who'd been the commanding officer during those 72 hours and who'd written a recommendation for my promotion that focused on leadership under impossible circumstances. Tech Sergeant Parker, one of the 12 we'd extracted, who sent me a Christmas card every year with nothing written inside except, "Thank you." These people knew. They didn't need the full story because they'd lived pieces of it. Their understanding was implicit, earned through shared experience rather than explanation. But family was different. Family wanted connection without context, love without understanding. They wanted me to be both extraordinary and ordinary, a hero at a distance, a regular person up close. The cognitive dissonance exhausted them, and it exhausted me trying to bridge it. 3 weeks after the barbecue, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "It's Evan. Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a long time. Thought about deleting it. Thought about blocking the number. Thought about all the ways this conversation could go wrong. Finally, I typed back, "When and where?" We met at a coffee shop near base, neutral territory, public enough to keep things civil, private enough to talk honestly. I arrived at 1400 hours, exactly on time. He was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee he hadn't touched. He stood when I walked in. "Thanks for coming." I sat down without acknowledging the gratitude. "You wanted to talk." "So talk." He looked older than I remembered. Tired. Like the last 3 weeks had cost him something. "I don't know where to start. How about with why you thought my pain was funny?" He flinched. "I didn't think it was pain. I thought it was. I don't know. I thought you'd just made some mistakes and gotten help and moved on. I didn't know about the mission. About what happened. You didn't need to know about the mission to know that mocking someone's recovery is cruel. You're right." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I was jealous. That's not an excuse, but it's the truth. You've always had your life together, and I've always been a mess. It felt good for a second to think that you'd screwed up too. That you weren't perfect. I've never been perfect, Evan. I've just been disciplined. There's a difference. I know that now. He finally looked at me directly. My dad sat me down the night after the barbecue. Told me everything he was allowed to tell me. About the operation, about what you did, about what it cost you. He said I'd spent my whole life confusing your strength for judgment and his absence for abandonment, and that it was time I grew up and took responsibility for my own failures instead of resenting everyone else for their success. It sounded like something Colonel Charles would say. Harsh, but accurate. No comfort, just truth. He's not wrong, I said. No, he's not. Evan picked up one of the coffee cups, then set it down without drinking. I'm sorry. Not just for the barbecue, but for years of being a shit cousin. For taking your help and resenting you for it. For making jokes instead of asking real questions. For being so wrapped up in my own failures that I couldn't see what you were actually dealing with. The apology was better than I'd expected. More honest, more thorough. But apologies don't erase years of disrespect. I appreciate that, I said carefully. But appreciation isn't the same as absolution. I know. I'm not asking for absolution. I just wanted you to know that I understand now. What service means. What sacrifice means. What it costs to be the person who makes hard calls so that people like me can sit around complaining about our easy lives. The bitterness in his voice was new. Self-directed instead of projected. Evan, I never wanted you to feel less than. I just wanted you to grow up. Well, congratulations. Mission accomplished. He tried to smile, but it didn't quite work. My dad suggested I consider enlisting. Said it might give me some perspective. Are you going to? I don't know. Maybe. Probably not. I'm 28, out of shape, and not exactly the poster child for military discipline. He shrugged. But I'm going to figure something out. Something real. Not another startup fantasy or get-rich-quick scheme. Something where I actually contribute instead of just taking up space. It was the most grown-up thing I'd ever heard him say. We sat in silence for a moment. The coffee shop hummed around us, espresso machines hissing, quiet conversations overlapping, someone's laptop clicking in the corner. I don't know if we can go back to how things were, I said finally. Before all this. I don't think we should, he replied. How things were wasn't working. Not for either of us. So what do? We start over. As adults instead of kids. As people who actually see each other instead of projections of each other. He finally took a sip of his coffee, grimaced at the cold. If you're willing. I thought about it. About all the years of covering for him, helping him, watching him squander opportunities and blame everyone else. About the barbecue, the mockery, the laughter. About Colonel Charles standing up and exposing truths I'd kept buried for good reasons. But I also thought about the fact that he'd shown up. That he'd apologized without excuses. That he was trying, however imperfectly, to be better. I'm willing to try, I said. But on one condition. What? No more jokes about my service. No more casual mockery of things you don't understand. If you have questions, ask them respectfully. If you don't understand something, say so. But don't ever turn my life into entertainment again. He nodded slowly. Deal. We finished our coffee, his cold, mine lukewarm, and talked about smaller things. His recent breakup, my upcoming training rotation, Aunt Caroline's garden, Uncle Jim's new boat. Surface-level stuff, the building blocks of a different kind of relationship. When we left, he offered his hand. I shook it. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely. But it was a start. 6 months after the barbecue, I stood in Colonel Sarah Chen's office at 0900 hours, receiving news I'd spent 3 years working toward and half expecting would never come. Congratulations, Lieutenant Colonel Hudson. She handed me the official letter. Promotion board met last month. You've been selected below the zone. Below the zone meant early promotion, ahead of my peer group. It meant the Air Force had identified me as an officer with exceptional potential. It also meant that despite everything, despite Operation Halcyon, despite the recovery program, despite all the ways I'd cracked under pressure, someone had decided I was worth investing in. Thank you, ma'am. I kept my voice steady, professional. You've earned it. The assignment that comes with it is unconventional, though. They're standing up a new position within the Air Force Recovery and Reintegration Program. They need someone with operational experience who's also been through the system. Someone who can speak from both sides of the desk. Resilience officer, I said. Exactly. Counseling, program development, advocacy for airmen dealing with combat stress and transition challenges. It's not traditional operations, and it won't lead to a command billet. But it's important work. I thought about those 72 hours. About the voices on the radio. About the months after when I'd struggled to function. About Lieutenant Colonel Chen pulling me aside and making me get help even when I'd insisted I was fine. I'll take it, I said. You haven't heard the details yet. I don't need to. If it means helping people who are where I was, preventing them from drowning the way I almost did, then I want it. She smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her in our entire professional relationship. I told the board you'd say that. They're counting on you to build something meaningful. Don't let them down. No, ma'am. The promotion ceremony was small, held on a Friday afternoon with just my immediate chain of command and a handful of invited guests. My parents flew in. Aunt Caroline and Colonel Charles came. Even Evan showed up, wearing the first suit I'd seen him in since his high school graduation. When Colonel Chen pinned on my new rank insignia, silver oak leaves replacing the gold, I felt the weight of them. Not just the physical weight, but the responsibility they represented. Lieutenant Colonel. Oh, 5. Senior Field Grade Officer. The rank my father had held when he'd given me advice about building a different kind of family. The ceremony ended with a small reception, punch and cookies in a conference room, people making polite conversation and offering congratulations. Evan approached carefully, like he wasn't sure of his welcome. Congratulations, Lieutenant Colonel, he said, getting the title right. Thank you. My dad explained what below the zone means. That's a big deal. It is. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable. We talked a few times since the coffee shop meeting, brief phone calls, a couple of text exchanges, but we were still rebuilding, still learning how to interact without the old patterns. I wanted to tell you. I got a job. Actual job, not a startup idea. Working for a nonprofit that does job training for veterans. Administrative stuff, nothing fancy, but it's real and it matters. Something loosened in my chest. That's great, Evan. Really? Yeah, well, figured I should do something useful. Contribute instead of just existing. He glanced at his father across the room. Dad helped me get the interview, but I got the job on my own. Showed up on time, followed through, did the work. Novel concept for me. I smiled. Growth looks good on you. Feels weird, but okay. He paused. For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. I know I've been a shit at showing it, but I am. Always have been, underneath all the jealousy and insecurity. I know, I said. And I meant it. The reception wound down. People drifted out, back to their regular duties and Friday afternoon plans. Colonel Charles approached as I was gathering my things. Lieutenant Colonel Hudson, he said formally, then smiled. Well done, Victoria. Thank you, sir. For everything. He understood what I meant. Not just the support during the ceremony, but the intervention at the barbecue. The truth-telling that had cost his son pride, but gained him perspective. I should have said something sooner, he admitted. Years ago, when I first read that after-action report. Should have made sure you knew that people who understood the weight were watching, that you weren't alone in carrying it. You were respecting the classification. I was. But I also could have found a way to let you know without compromising security. Instead, I stayed silent and let my son mock something he didn't understand while you carried the burden of his ignorance on top of everything else. He shook his head. That was wrong. You fixed it when it mattered. Maybe. Or maybe I just finally did what I should have done all along, told the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. He glanced at Evan, who was talking with my mother across the room. He's trying. It's messy and imperfect, but he's trying. I can see that. Give him time. He's spent 28 years avoiding responsibility. Learning to embrace it won't happen overnight. I know. I'm giving him room to grow. Colonel Charles nodded. That's all anyone can ask. Room to grow and people who believe growth is possible. He left soon after. My parents stayed for dinner at a restaurant off base, nothing fancy, just burgers and conversation about safe topics like their garden and the neighbor's new dog. Normal family stuff, the kind of easy interaction that felt precious precisely because it was ordinary. When I got home that night, I sat on my couch with my new rank insignia in hand and thought about the path that had led here. The academy. The deployments. Operation Halcyon and its aftermath. The recovery program. The awkward family gatherings. Evan's mockery and Colonel Charles's intervention. The slow, painful process of rebuilding trust and respect. None of it had been linear. None of it had been easy. But it had all been necessary. I thought about the new position, the resilience officer role. It would mean talking to airmen who were struggling, who were dealing with combat stress or transition challenges, or the thousand small ways that military service cracks people open. It would mean being vulnerable about my own struggles, using my story as a tool to help others. The idea terrified and energized me in equal measure. But then again, that's what growth feels like. Terrifying and energizing. Uncomfortable and necessary. The space between who you were and who you're becoming, stretched taut with possibility and risk. I set the rank insignia on the coffee table and pulled out my laptop. Opened a blank document. Started drafting the framework for what the resilience program could look like, what resources were needed, what approaches might work, what stories could be told without compromising security or dignity. Outside, the sun set over the base. Aircraft took off and landed with mechanical precision. Somewhere, airmen were standing watch, making decisions, carrying burdens they couldn't name. And I was here, finally, in a position to help. It felt right. It felt earned. It felt like purpose. The first 3 months in my new role as a resilience officer were harder than any deployment I'd done. Combat has clear parameters, defined threats, measurable objectives, explicit chains of command. Helping people rebuild themselves after trauma has none of that clarity. Every airman who walked into my office carried a different story. Some had seen combat. Others had dealt with assault, addiction, family crises, the grinding stress of deployment after deployment. Some came voluntarily. Others came because a commander had ordered them to talk to someone. My job was to listen, guide, advocate, and build systems that would catch people before they broke completely. The work was exhausting. It was also the most meaningful thing I'd ever done. Captain Rene Alvarez called one evening around 2000 hours. We'd stayed in touch since Operation Halcyon, the kind of friendship forged in crisis and maintained through irregular check-ins across time zones and assignments. "How's the new gig?" she asked. "Brutal. Necessary. Important." That's a very you assessment. I could hear her smile through the phone. "Seriously, though. How are you holding up?" "Some days better than others. Had an airman in my office yesterday who reminded me of myself 3 years ago. Same look, same defensive posture, same insistence that she was fine even though she was clearly drowning. What did you tell her?" "That drowning looks different than people expect. That asking for help isn't weakness. That the military teaches us to be strong but doesn't always teach us that strength includes knowing when to reach out." "Did she listen?" "I don't know yet. She came back today, though. So that's something." Renee was quiet for a moment. "You're good at this, Vic. Better than you probably realize. I'm just doing what someone did for me. Paying it forward. That's exactly why you're good at it." We talked for another hour about her current assignment, mutual friends from our academy days, the peculiar challenges of being a female field grade officer in a still male-dominated force. Normal conversation between people who understood each other's context without needing constant explanation. When we hung up, I felt steadier. Reminded that the different kind of family my father had talked about was real and sustaining. The following month, I received an invitation to speak at the Air Force Academy. A panel on leadership and resilience aimed at junior cadets who were just beginning to understand what service actually meant. I almost declined. Public speaking had never been my strength, and talking about Operation Halcyon, even in general terms, felt like exposing wounds that had barely healed. But Major Eric Dunn, my former commanding officer, called me before I could send the rejection email. "You're thinking of saying no," he said without preamble. How did you know about the invitation? I recommended you for it. So I'm checking to make sure you don't chicken out. I'm not chickening out. I'm being realistic about my skill set. Your skill set includes surviving something that would have broken most officers and using that experience to help others. That's exactly what these cadets need to hear. They need to hear from someone more impressive. Someone with combat experience who came through it without falling apart. They need to hear from someone real. Someone who tells the truth about the cost of service and the strength it takes to ask for help. Stop underselling yourself, Lieutenant Colonel. You've earned the right to tell your story. He hung up before I could argue further. I stared at the invitation for a long time. Thought about the cadets who would be in that audience. Young, idealistic, terrified, ambitious. Thought about who I'd been at their age, full of certainty and unaware of how thoroughly the Air Force would reshape me. Finally, I typed out an acceptance email and hit send before I could second-guess myself. The panel was scheduled for a Saturday morning in April. I flew into Colorado Springs the night before, stayed in a hotel near campus, and barely slept. Kept rehearsing what I'd say, how much detail to include, whether I should mention the drinking or just talk about operational stress in abstract terms. The panel room was packed. About 300 cadets, ranging from first years to seniors, filling every seat and lining the walls. The energy was electric, that particular intensity that comes from young people who've volunteered for something bigger than themselves and are starting to understand the weight of that choice. I was the last speaker, following a brigadier general who'd commanded fighter wings and a chief master sergeant who'd spent 30 years in special operations. Hard acts to follow. When it was my turn, I stood at the podium and looked out at those young faces. Saw myself in them. Saw Evan in some of them too, the ones who looked cocky and certain, who hadn't yet learned that confidence without humility was just arrogance waiting to be humbled. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Hudson, I began. And I'm going to tell you something that most officers don't talk about. I'm going to tell you about the time I broke. The room went utterly silent. I told them about Operation Halcyon. Not the classified details, but the emotional truth, what it felt like to coordinate a rescue while listening to people die, what it cost to make decisions with incomplete information and catastrophic stakes, how I'd held myself together through 72 hours of crisis and then fell apart in the months after. I told them about the drinking, about the recovery program, about the shame I'd felt and the strength it took to accept help. I told them about the family barbecue, about my cousin's mockery, about Colonel Charles standing up and telling the truth I'd been too proud or too scared to share. And I told them about the path forward, about how recovery wasn't the end of my career, but the foundation for a new kind of service, about how asking for help had made me a better officer, about how strength includes vulnerability when deployed with wisdom. When I finished, no one moved. The silence stretched for several heartbeats. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Then the entire room was on its feet, applauding, and I saw tears on some faces, recognition on others, that particular expression of someone who needed to hear exactly what I'd just said. After the panel, cadets lined up to talk to me. Some shared their own struggles. Others asked questions about navigating the tension between military culture and mental health. A few just said thank you, like they'd been given permission to be human in an environment that often demanded perfection. One young woman, a third-year cadet with sharp eyes and careful posture, waited until everyone else had left. "Ma'am, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Do you regret it? The drinking, the recovery, the way it impacted your career?" I thought about it honestly. No. I regret the circumstances that led to it. I regret that Operation Halcyon went wrong, that people died, that the burden fell so heavily. But the recovery itself? That saved my life. And it taught me something I wouldn't have learned any other way. What's that? That service isn't about being invincible. It's about being resilient. There's a difference. She nodded slowly, processing. Thank you, ma'am. What's your name, cadet? Jensen, ma'am. If you ever need someone to talk to about anything, you have my contact information now. Use it. Something eased in her expression. Yes, ma'am. I will. I flew back to base that afternoon, exhausted but lighter somehow. The act of speaking truth, even painful truth, had released something I hadn't known I was still carrying. The following week, I received an email from Cadet Jensen. Brief, formal, but clear. Ma'am, I took your advice and reached out to base counseling. Starting sessions next week. Thank you for making it okay to not be okay. Respectfully, Cadet Jensen. I saved that email, printed it out and pinned it to the wall of my office, right next to my promotion certificate and a photo of my squadron from Operation Halcyon. Proof that vulnerability, deployed correctly, could be as powerful as any weapon. Proof that my story mattered not because it was exceptional, but because it was real. Proof that the work I was doing now, unglamorous, difficult, necessary, was exactly where I needed to be. 2 years into my role as a resilience officer, I stood on the tarmac at 0600 hours, watching new recruits run morning drills. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. The air smelled like jet fuel and possibility. My phone buzzed with a text from Evan. Got promoted to program coordinator. First real promotion of my life. Thought you'd want to know. I smiled and typed back, proud of you. That's real growth. His response came quickly. Learned from the best. Well, eventually. After being an idiot for a while first. Everyone's an idiot for a while. The key is growing out of it. Working on it every day. Thanks, Vic. For not giving up on me. Family doesn't give up. We just recalibrate expectations and hold each other accountable. That should be on a bumper sticker. Please don't put that on a bumper sticker. Too late. Already ordered 500. I laughed, pocketed my phone, and watched the recruits complete their final lap. They were young, exhausted, determined. Some would make it through basic training and go on to long, distinguished careers. Others would wash out or serve briefly and move on to civilian life. All of them would be changed by what they learned here. The path wasn't linear. It never was. But that was the point. My own path had been anything but straight. Academy to Germany to Kuwait to Operation Halcyon to breaking to recovery to lieutenant colonel to resilience officer. Each turn had felt like a detour at the time. Looking back, I could see how every piece had been necessary, how even the breaking had been part of building something stronger. The annual family gathering was coming up in a few weeks. This time, I wasn't dreading it. Evan had changed. Not completely, he was still prone to bad jokes and questionable fashion choices, but fundamentally. He asked better questions now. Listened more than he talked. Contributed instead of just consuming. Colonel Charles had retired from his civilian contracting job and was spending his time volunteering with veteran organizations. Aunt Caroline had started a garden club. My parents were healthy and happy, enjoying their retirement in Florida. Things were good. Stable. Not perfect, but real. At the next gathering, no one made jokes about my drinking. When someone new to the family asked about my role, Evan was the first to explain, accurately, respectfully, with genuine pride in his voice. My cousin works with airmen who are dealing with combat stress and transition challenges, he said. She helps them find resources and builds programs to support resilience. It's important work. The person nodded, impressed, but not sure what to say. Evan looked at me and smiled. She's the real deal. Saved lives overseas and still saving them now, just differently. Thank you, I said quietly later, when we had a moment alone. Just telling the truth. He shrugged. Turns out that's way easier than making up stories to hide my own insecurity. Character development looks good on you. Yeah, well, better late than never. He paused. Hey, I've been meaning to ask. That nonprofit I work for, we're starting a mentorship program for transitioning veterans. Any chance you'd be willing to come speak sometime? Share your perspective on military to civilian transition and mental health resources. I'd be honored. Cool. I'll set it up. He glanced back at the gathering, where our family was eating and laughing and being generally chaotic. You know what's weird? I used to hate these things because I felt like I didn't measure up. Now I actually enjoy them. What changed? I stopped competing with everyone else's achievements and started focusing on building my own. Turns out life gets a lot easier when you're not constantly resentful of other people's success. That's very mature of you. Don't worry, I'm still immature about plenty of other things. But I'm working on it. We rejoined the group. The afternoon passed easily, stories and food, and the comfortable chaos of family. When the sun started to set, I found myself standing next to Colonel Charles, watching kids chase each other across the yard. "You did good work that night," I said. "At the barbecue." Telling the truth. "I should have done it sooner." "Maybe. But you did it when it mattered most." He nodded. "How's the resilience work going?" "Hard. Meaningful. I'm building something that I think will outlast my career." "That's the best kind of legacy." He took a sip of his drink. "Your father would be proud." "Hell, I'm proud. You took something that could have ended your career and turned it into a foundation for helping others." I had good examples. People who told me the truth when I needed to hear it, even when it was uncomfortable. That's what service is about, isn't it? Telling hard truths and doing necessary work, whether or not it's comfortable or recognized. "Yes, sir. It is." The gathering wound down. People said their goodbyes, made plans for next time, drifted back to their separate lives. Evan hugged me before he left, a real hug, not the awkward side squeeze from previous years. "Thanks for giving me a second chance," he said. "Everyone deserves a second chance if they're willing to do the work." "I'm doing the work." "I know. Keep it up." He left with his parents. I helped my aunt clean up, then drove back to base as the sky darkened and stars began appearing. My apartment was quiet when I got home. I poured a glass of water, stood at my window looking out at the city lights, and thought about the journey that had brought me here. I used to think recovery meant fixing what was broken, returning to some previous version of myself that existed before Operation Halcyon, before the drinking, before the pain. But I understood now that recovery meant integration. Taking all the broken pieces and building something new, not better or worse than what came before, just different. More honest. More whole. The next morning, I returned to the tarmac. Same sunrise, same recruits, different day. A young airman approached fresh from basic, nervous, trying to project confidence she didn't quite feel yet. "Ma'am, I was hoping to ask you about the resilience program. I've been having some trouble adjusting since I got here, and someone suggested I talk to you." I recognized that look. The shame mixed with hope, the fear of being seen as weak, the desperate need for help warring with military pride. "Walk with me," I said. We walked across the tarmac as the sun climbed higher, and I told her what I'd learned. Not the classified details, not the dramatic moments, just the essential truth, that strength includes knowing when to ask for help. That service isn't about being invincible, it's about being resilient. That recovery is possible, and asking for support is an act of courage, not weakness. That everyone breaks sometimes, and the real measure of character is what you build in the aftermath. She listened carefully, asked good questions, and by the end of our walk, she looked lighter. Not fixed, that would take time, but hopeful. Like she'd been given permission to be human in an environment that often demanded perfection. "Thank you, ma'am," she said. "Come see me again next week. Let's make sure you're getting the support you need." "Yes, ma'am. I will." She saluted and walked away, and I stood there watching her go, thinking about all the airmen I'd helped over the last 2 years, all the ones still to come. Thinking about my own journey from breaking to recovery to purpose. The wind caught the edge of my uniform. Aircraft engines roared as a transport lifted off, heading toward some distant mission I wouldn't know the details of. The base hummed with the constant activity of people in service to something larger than themselves. And I realized, standing there in that moment, that I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was whole. Not perfect. Not without scars. But whole in a way that included all my history, the achievements and the failures, the strength and the breaking, the silence and the truth-telling. I walked back toward my office as the sun climbed higher, ready for whatever came next. Ready to help the next airman who walked through my door carrying burdens they couldn't name. Ready to keep building systems that caught people before they fell too far. Ready to keep serving in this new way for as long as I was needed. The morning light was warm on my face. Somewhere across the base, reveille was playing. Another day beginning. Another chance to make a difference. Another opportunity to prove that resilience isn't about never breaking. It's about what you build in the aftermath. And what I'd built, from broken pieces and hard truths and second chances, was a life that mattered. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real and earned and mine. 1 year later, I stood in front of the mirror in my quarters, adjusting my dress uniform. The ceremony was scheduled for 1100 hours, a formal event I'd tried to decline 3 times before my commander made it clear that refusal wasn't actually an option. The Air Force was presenting me with the Meritorious Service Medal for my work developing the Resilience Program. 2 years of building frameworks, training counselors, advocating for airmen, and slowly changing the culture around mental health support had apparently been noticed at levels far above my pay grade. I still wasn't comfortable with recognition. Preferred to work quietly, let the results speak for themselves. But military culture required public acknowledgement of achievement, and arguing with 30 years of tradition seemed pointless. My phone rang. My mother, calling from Florida. "Big day," she said when I answered. "It's just a ceremony, Mom." "It's never just a ceremony with you. You've built something important, Victoria. Let yourself acknowledge that." "I'm trying. Your father would be so proud." Her voice caught slightly. He'd passed away 6 months earlier, heart attack, sudden, the kind of loss that leaves you reeling even when you know intellectually that everyone's time eventually runs out. He told me before he died that watching you transform your pain into purpose was the proudest moment of his career. Not his own achievements, yours. I closed my eyes, breathing through the grief that still felt fresh. I wish he was here. He is. In everything you do. She paused. Evan's coming to the ceremony, you know. He asked me for the details last week. That surprised me. He doesn't need to do that. He wants to. Said you showed up for him when he needed it, so he's showing up for you now. That's what family does. After we hung up, I finished getting ready and drove to the base chapel where the ceremony would be held. The parking lot was more crowded than I'd expected. I'd requested a small event, just my immediate chain of command and maybe a handful of colleagues. Apparently, small was a relative term. Inside, the chapel had been transformed into a formal ceremony space. Rows of chairs filled with people in uniform. A small stage with a podium and the American flag. Everything polished and precise, the military aesthetic of honor and tradition. Colonel Chin found me before the ceremony started. "Ready?" "No, but I'll manage." She smiled. "There are about 100 people here who want to celebrate what you've built. Try to let them." 100. I'd expected 20, maybe 30. Your work has touched a lot of lives, Victoria. More than you realize. The ceremony began promptly at 1100. I sat in the front row while my commander, Brigadier General Morrison, spoke about the Resilience Program's impact. Statistics about increased utilization of mental health services, decreased stigma around seeking help, improved retention rates among airmen who'd received support. Numbers that represented real people, real lives changed. Then came the testimonials. Captain Alvarez spoke about Operation Halcyon and how my leadership under impossible circumstances had demonstrated the kind of strength the Air Force needed more of. Tech Sergeant Parker, one of the 12 we'd extracted that night, talked about how I'd coordinated his rescue and then, years later, helped him through his own recovery from PTSD. And then Cadet Jensen, now Second Lieutenant Jensen, stood up. She'd graduated from the academy 8 months earlier and was stationed at the same base for initial training. "Ma'am gave me permission to be human," she said, her voice steady. "She came to the academy and told us the truth about service, about breaking, about recovery. She made it okay to ask for help. Because of her, I'm standing here today instead of washing out or worse. Because of her, I'm an officer who understands that leadership includes vulnerability." I felt my throat tighten. Hadn't expected that, hadn't realized how much my academy talk had mattered to her specifically. The medal presentation itself was brief. General Morrison read the citation, highlighting specific achievements and the program's measurable impact. Then he pinned the medal to my uniform, shook my hand, and stepped back to salute. The room rose. Everyone saluting. That moment of formal military recognition that always felt both humbling and overwhelming. When it was my turn to speak, I approached the podium and looked out at the crowd. Saw Colonel Chin and my team from the Resilience Office. Saw Lieutenant Jensen and Tech Sergeant Parker. Saw colleagues I'd worked with over the years, airmen I'd counseled, commanders who'd supported the program even when it was controversial. And in the back row, slightly out of place in a civilian suit, I saw Evan. Next to him, Colonel Charles and Aunt Caroline. They'd flown out for this. For me. Thank you for this honor, I began. But I want to be clear about something. This medal represents the work of dozens of people, counselors, chaplains, commanders, medical professionals, and most importantly, the airmen who had the courage to ask for help when they needed it. I'm standing here because I had people who caught me when I fell. This recognition belongs to all of them. I paused, organizing my thoughts. 2 years ago, I stood in front of cadets at the academy and told them about the time I broke. It was terrifying. I didn't know if sharing that story would help or hurt, whether it would be seen as strength or weakness. But I told it because someone needed to say out loud that service is hard, that breaking doesn't mean failing, and that asking for help is an act of courage. The room was silent, attentive. Since then, I've worked with hundreds of airmen dealing with combat stress, transition challenges, personal crises. I've seen the cost of staying silent and the power of speaking truth. I've learned that resilience isn't about being unbreakable, it's about knowing how to rebuild when you shatter. And I've learned that the strongest thing any of us can do is admit when we're struggling and reach out for support. I looked at Evan in the back row. He was watching me with an expression I'd never seen on his face before, pure, uncomplicated pride. I used to think recovery meant fixing what was broken, returning to some previous version of myself that existed before trauma. But recovery is actually about integration. Taking all the pieces, the good and the bad, the achievements and the failures, and building something new. Something honest. Something whole. My voice steadied. So this medal? It represents every airman who chose recovery over silence. Every commander who supported mental health initiatives even when it wasn't popular. Every counselor who showed up day after day to do the hard work of helping people heal. Every family member who loved someone through their darkest moments. This belongs to all of you. The applause that followed was thunderous. Not just polite ceremony applause, but genuine appreciation. It washed over me like a wave, and for the first time in my career, I let myself actually feel it. Let myself acknowledge that the work mattered, that the pain had purpose, that the journey from breaking to building had been worth it. The reception afterward was held in an adjacent building. People approached to offer congratulations, share their own stories, thank me for making space for vulnerability in an environment that traditionally demanded invulnerability. Evan found me during a quiet moment. That was incredible, Vic. Thank you for coming. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. You've been showing up for me my whole life, taking blame for my mistakes, writing references, being patient while I figured my life out. The least I can do is show up when you're being recognized for actually changing people's lives. Colonel Charles joined us, Aunt Caroline at his side. Proud of you, Victoria. Always have been, but especially now. Thank you, sir. You know what strikes me, he continued. You took the worst moment of your career and transformed it into your greatest contribution. That's not just resilience, that's wisdom. Later, after most people had left and the reception was winding down, I stood outside watching aircraft take off into the late afternoon sky. Lieutenant Jensen approached, hesitant but determined. Ma'am, I wanted to thank you again. For everything. You've already thanked me. And you did the hard work yourself. I know. But I wanted to tell you, I'm applying to the Resilience Officer Training Program. Because of what you built, because of what you showed me was possible. I want to do this work too. Something warm spread through my chest. That's wonderful. The Air Force needs more officers who understand both the operational side and the human side. Will you write me a recommendation? Absolutely. She smiled, saluted, and walked away. I watched her go, thinking about the ripple effects. How my breaking had led to my recovery, which had led to this program, which was now inspiring the next generation of officers to prioritize mental health and resilience. None of it had been planned. All of it had been necessary. My phone buzzed with a text from Captain Alvarez. Saw the pictures. Congratulations on the medal. You've earned it 10 times over. Proud to know you. I typed back. Couldn't have done any of this without people like you showing me what real strength looks like. Her response came quickly. Real strength is what you're showing now, using your story to help others. That's the legacy that matters. I pocketed my phone and watched the sun begin its descent. The base was quieting down, transitioning from day shift to evening operations. Somewhere, airmen were standing watch, making decisions, carrying burdens they couldn't name. And now, because of the program we'd built, they had resources. They had support. They had permission to be human. The journey from that barbecue 3 years ago to this moment had been long and complicated, full of pain and growth, mistakes and corrections, breaking and rebuilding. But standing here now, wearing this medal, knowing that the work would continue long after I'd moved on to other assignments, I understood something fundamental. My story had never been just about me. It had always been about what could be built from honest acknowledgement of struggle. About how vulnerability, deployed with wisdom, could create space for others to heal. About how the worst moments could become the foundation for the most meaningful work. I wasn't the same person who'd stood at that barbecue watching my cousin mock my pain. I wasn't even the same person who'd broken after Operation Halcyon. I'd been reshaped by every experience, refined by every challenge, strengthened by every moment of choosing honesty over hiding. And I was still becoming. Still learning, still growing, still figuring out what service meant at this stage of my career. But I was doing it with my eyes open. With support. With purpose. The metal on my uniform caught the fading sunlight. A symbol of recognition, yes. But more importantly, a symbol of transformation. Of resilience. Of the possibility that exists when we choose to build something meaningful from our broken pieces. I took a deep breath of evening air and walked back toward my car. Tomorrow there would be more airmen to counsel, more programs to develop, more work to do. The mission never really ended, it just evolved. But tonight, I would let myself rest in the knowledge that the work mattered. That the journey had been worth it. That recovery wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of something better. The sky darkened. Stars began appearing. Another day ending, another beginning on the horizon. And I was ready for whatever came next. Thanks for staying with me. If this hit home, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs backup today. Quick questions for you. Have you ever had a family member turn your pain into a joke? What did you do? If you were in my shoes, what would you have said to Evan in that moment? Who's been your Colonel Charles, the person who spoke up when you couldn't? For those in recovery from anything, what boundary are you setting this week? Should I confront Evan on camera for a follow-up or leave it in the past? Drop your answers in the comments and turn on notifications for the next chapter. Your story could help someone else stand their ground.